He knew opening. What if the most breathtaking beings in all creation aren't the ones we imagine, but the ones who have never taken their eyes off God? Opening, storytelling version. If you listen closely, closer than the noise of your day, closer than the thoughts that pull you in every direction, you might hear it. A sound that doesn't belong to earth. A sound that existed long before oceans formed or mountains rose. A sound that has never paused, not for a single heartbeat in all eternity. It is the sound of worship, not the kind sung by human voices, fragile and trembling, but the kind spoken by beings who have stood, lived before the brilliance of God without ever looking away. And their story is where everything begins. There are moments in human history when heaven seems impossibly far away, like a distant realm sealed behind clouds and mystery. But then there are moments when that veil becomes thin, almost transparent, and someone, an ordinary human being, gets to see what no eye was ever meant to see. John was one of those people, exiled, alone, and forgotten by his world. He found himself on a lonely island named Patmos. It was the kind of place where the nights felt longer than they should, where the wind's howl reminded you of everything you had lost. To Rome, John was a nuisance, a problem, a voice they tried to silence by pushing him to the edges of civilization. But what Rome never understood was this. You can exile a man's body, but you cannot exile him from God. And so it happened, on a day that began like any other, that the sky over Patmos opened. Not simply the sky that John could see, but the heavens that no human was ever meant to see. John didn't climb into heaven. He didn't travel through space or drift into a dream. He was called, summoned, as though heaven itself bent down and whispered, "Come." And when heaven calls, you don't walk, you are carried. What John saw defies human language. Every word he tried to use afterward was like trying to describe the sun using only the color yellow. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. Even John himself admits this. He saw things he struggled to describe, not because they were unclear, but because they were too clear, too real, so real that human vocabulary simply fractured under their weight. And yet, there was one thing he described without hesitation, the four living creatures. To us, they might seem strange, unusual, even terrifying. But to heaven, they are not strange at all. They are familiar, eternal witnesses of God's glory, positioned right next to his throne. But before we meet them, you need to imagine what John saw first. A throne, not cold or carved or made from earthly material. A throne woven from light, color, fire, thunder, and presence. A throne that wasn't merely an object, but the center of all existence. Around this throne was something like a sea, clear as crystal but alive, shifting with brilliance, as if glass had learned how to breathe. Thunder rolled from it, not violently, but with the authority of a king whose voice shapes galaxies. Lightning flashed from the throne, not the kind that strikes fear into the heart, but the kind that announces power, raw, pure, unfiltered power. And around it were elders, 24 of them, clothed in white, crowned in glory. They did not sit like weary men. They sat like witnesses of eternity, like guardians of memories too ancient for time. Yet even these elders, honored, exalted, radiant, were not the closest beings to the throne. There were others, beings whose entire existence revolves around the one seated on that throne. Beings whose voices have echoed across eternity. Beings we often overlook because their appearance does not fit what art or culture has taught us. They are called the four living creatures, and they are unlike anything you have ever imagined. You might picture angels as gentle, glowing figures in flowing robes. But these beings are nothing like that. John describes them with awe and a touch of trembling, not because they were monstrous, but because they were holy. So holy that even heaven itself gives them space. Each one had a different face. A lion, an ox, a man, an eagle. Not masks, not symbols. Faces. Faces that meant something. Faces that told a story, God's story. The lion, the face of irresistible power. The ox, the face of endurance and sacrifice. The man, the face of wisdom and spirit. The eagle, the face of majesty and transcendence. Together, they formed a portrait of the God they worshipped, a God who is strong, sacrificial, wise, and exalted above all things. But it wasn't their faces that John noticed first. It was their eyes. Eyes everywhere, front, back, within, around. Eyes that never closed, never dimmed, never stopped witnessing the glory of God. Not because they were overwhelmed, but because they were designed to behold Him, as if their very essence depended on seeing God in every moment. People sometimes wonder, why so many eyes? The answer is not frightening, it's beautiful. They were created to never miss a single glimpse of God's glory. Not one, not ever. And then John hears something, a sound that shakes him to his core. These beings begin to speak, not casually, not softly, not like humans who choose their words based on mood or moment. Their voices rise like rolling waves, like wind through ancient mountains, and their message is simple, powerful, and eternal. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. They don't whisper it. They don't chant out of routine. They don't repeat it because they're required to. They say it because every second they look at Him reveals something new. Every moment brings a fresh reason to worship. Every breath unwraps a new layer of His beauty. They never stop because God never stops being holy. And when they speak, when their voices rise, heaven responds. The elders fall from their thrones. Crowns, symbols of authority, are thrown down because in the presence of God, authority is not something you hold. It is something you surrender. Lightning flashes, thunder rolls, the sea of glass shimmers, and John, overwhelmed, watches as heaven moves like a single, living being, all because for creatures lifted their voices. But this isn't the first time humanity has heard of these beings. Hundreds of years before John stood on Patmos, another man saw creatures like them, a prophet living among exiles, a man named Ezekiel. He saw fire, wheels glowing like molten metal, creatures moving with purpose and precision, wings that whispered like rushing waters, and eyes, so many eyes. Ezekiel tried his best to describe them, but even he struggled, not because he didn't understand, but because what he saw left him with the same sense of trembling awe that John felt centuries later. And even before Ezekiel, another prophet, Isaiah, saw beings in heaven, fire-filled, radiant, singing the same song, Holy, holy, holy. 3 men, 3 moments, 3 visions separated by centuries, 1 reality, God's throne, God's glory, God's witnesses, the same beings, the same worship, the same holiness. Heaven has not changed. It does not evolve, improve, or modernize. It simply is the eternal reflection of eternal God. Most people talk about heaven as a place where we will finally understand everything. But in reality, heaven is a place where we will finally see everything, and seeing God will be enough. That is why these living creatures matter. They do not teach with words. They teach with presence. They show us what it means to behold God without distraction, without hesitation, without fear. We often rush through life trying to catch glimpses of God in moments, a sunrise, a miracle, an answered prayer. But these creatures stand in what we only taste, and their response is constant. He is holy. Their worship is not a song. It is a reaction, an instinct, a truth spoken the moment they see Him, a truth so real it echoes through eternity. And now, through John's eyes, through Ezekiel's trembling voice, through Isaiah's awe-filled words, that truth reaches us, not to scare us, not to overwhelm us, but to invite us, because their song is more than praise. It is an invitation into the heart of God holiness. And holiness is not distance. It is not cold perfection. It is not the dividing line that separates God from us. Holiness is the beauty of God's character, the completeness of His nature, the radiance of His love, the depth of His wisdom, the purity of His intentions. Holiness is what makes God, God. And as we journey deeper into the story, as we uncover the role of these extraordinary beings, as we explore what holiness truly means, one thing becomes clear. This is not just a heavenly scene. This is a revelation meant to change us. Because if these beings who have never looked away from God, never grow tired of saying holy, then perhaps holiness is something we have never fully understood. And maybe, just maybe, the creatures at God's throne are inviting us to see Him the way they see Him, to look again, to behold, to be transformed, which leads us into the heart of our journey, the part of the story where we step closer to the throne, closer to creatures themselves, and even closer to the one they worship. And this is where our exploration truly begins. Hook for next section, transition to body content. Because to understand who God is, we first need to understand the four beings who stand closest to Him, and why their unending worship still shakes heaven today. When we hear about the four living creatures, these beings closest to God's throne, we might imagine they simply stand still, repeating the same words over and over in a scene frozen in time. But that is far from the reality. What John saw in heaven was not a painting, it was a living symphony, a movement, a rhythm, a kingdom alive with purpose, beauty, and revelation. And those four creatures, those extraordinary witnesses, are at the center of it. But to understand them, we have to begin with something far simpler, the way God reveals Himself. Because the closer you stand to something powerful, the more clearly you see it. And those creatures have been standing closer to Him than any other created being since the very beginning. The faces that tell a story. Each of the four creatures carries a face. Not symbolic, not metaphorical, but real. And these faces are like windows into the character of God Himself. Imagine the first one, the face of a lion. A lion does not apologize for its strength. It moves with confidence, not arrogance. It does not force you to respect it. Its very presence commands it. When John saw the lion-faced creature near God's throne, he wasn't seeing an animal. He was seeing a truth. God is powerful, not violently, but majestically. Then there is the face of an ox. If the lion represents kingship, the ox represents devotion, tireless strength, willingness to carry burdens. The ox does not seek glory. It serves. It pushes forward even when the ground beneath it is difficult. Through this face, heaven proclaims another truth. God is faithful. God is steady. God carries His people. The third face is that of a man. You and I know what it means to be human. We know weakness, emotion, joy, confusion, love, fear. And yet, through this face, God reveals that He understands us, not from a distance, but from within. He became one of us through Christ. He walked our roads, felt our pain, celebrated our joys. This face declares, God is personal. God is relational. God knows His creation intimately. And finally, the face of an eagle. The eagle soars above storms. It sees what no one else sees. It rises effortlessly where others struggle. When John saw this face, heaven was proclaiming something profound. God is exalted. God is above all things, yet watches over every detail. Together, these faces do not contradict each other. They complete each other. Power, faithfulness, wisdom, majesty. These are not four gods. They are four dimensions of the same God. And the creatures who bear these faces reflect His glory like living mirrors, positioned closest to Him, so that everything they do, every movement, every cry, becomes a testimony of who He is. The eyes that never stop seeing. But the faces are only part of the mystery. John describes these creatures as being covered with eyes, front, back, above, beneath, even within. A strange image to our human imagination. But the meaning is breathtaking. Eyes represent perception, understanding, revelation, awareness. These creatures see everything God reveals to them, and what God reveals is endless. Every moment in God's presence is a discovery, not because God changes, He never does, but because He is infinite, and no created being can exhaust infinity. Have you ever looked at the sky and thought you understood it, only to notice later that there were depths of color you never saw before? Or watched the ocean from a cliff and felt there were layers beneath the surface your eyes could never reach? Multiply that feeling by eternity, and you may begin to understand what these creatures experience. Their eyes are not unsettling. They are beautiful. They show that they never stop learning, never stop seeing, never stop recognizing God's glory in deeper ways. And every revelation leads to worship, the worship that never grows old. One of the most misunderstood ideas about heaven is the belief that eternal worship must be boring. Many imagine it as an endless song on repeat, a choir that never ends, a kind of spiritual routine. But that is not the worship John witnessed. These creatures are not repeating words they memorized. They are responding to what they see. Every time they look toward God's throne, they witness a new facet of His holiness, a new depth, a new beauty, a new brilliance that they had never seen before. And so their worship erupts naturally. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was, and is to come. They say it again and again, not because it is required, but because every time they say it, it becomes more true, not less. They never grow tired, not because they are forced to worship, but because God's holiness never runs dry. If God were less magnificent, their worship would fade. If God were predictable, their praise would become mechanical. If God were limited, their cries would dim with time. But God is limitless, infinite in purity, love, power, wisdom, and beauty. And so the creatures respond with infinite worship. When heaven responds, every time the creatures raise their voices, something remarkable happens. Heaven moves. The 24 elders, sitting on thrones that symbolize authority over God's people across ages and generations, rise from their seats. Not slowly, not ceremonially, but as though worship pulls them upward. They remove their crowns, symbols of honor, achievement, and victory, and they throw them down before the throne. Think about that for a moment. The greatest honors heaven could bestow are placed at God's feet, not politely, not reluctantly, but with joy and urgency. Lightning flashes, thunder echoes, the sea of glass ripples with living light. The atmosphere of heaven is not still. It responds to God's glory like a heartbeat responds to life. I want you to picture it. The roar of adoration, the trembling of glory, the movement of countless wings, the sound of crowns striking the crystal floor of heaven, the thunderous pulse of God's presence. This is not the silence of a cold cathedral. This is the living, breathing kingdom of God, a place where everything centers on His holiness, the connection to earth. But here is the part that is often forgotten. Heaven's worship is not isolated from us. We are not watching from behind glass. We are not distant spectators. We are invited in. In the creature's worship, we see the posture God desires for our hearts. Not perfection, not eloquence, not rituals, but a simple, honest response to who He is. When God reveals Himself, the only fitting response is worship. And worship is not just a song. It is a surrender. When the elders throw their crowns, they are showing us how to live. They are telling us, lay down what you treasure most before the one who is worthy. Heaven teaches us how to worship on earth, not out of pressure, but out of revelation. When you truly see God, worship is no longer an obligation. It becomes a reaction. Ezekiel's vision, an earthly witness to a heavenly reality. Centuries before John, a prophet named Ezekiel saw something similar. Not in a comfortable temple, not in a moment of peace, but in exile. He saw storms. He saw fire. He saw wheels glowing like molten metal. He saw creatures whose movements were synchronized like lightning, swift, precise, purposeful. And he saw eyes, many eyes, just like John. The message was clear. Heaven had not abandoned God's people, even in their darkest hour. Ezekiel wasn't seeing something different from John. He was seeing the same heavenly reality from a different angle, like standing on another side of a mountain and discovering that its beauty stretches far beyond what you imagined. Ezekiel's encounter told the exiles, God is still enthroned. God is still holy. God is still with you. And John's encounter told the persecuted church the same truth hundreds of years later. Different men, different times. Same God, same throne, same creatures, same holiness. Isaiah's vision, the transformation of a prophet. Then there is Isaiah, before John, before Ezekiel, before exile, before visions of fire and wheels and storms. Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up, the train of His robe filling the temple, smoke rising, and seraphim calling out the same cry the creatures sang centuries later. Holy, holy, holy. Isaiah didn't respond with excitement. He responded with fear, with honesty, with recognition of his own brokenness. He said, "Woe is me, I am undone." In the presence of holiness, nothing is hidden. But God did not push Isaiah away. He purified him. He restored him. He called him. Isaiah discovered what John and Ezekiel would later see. Holiness does not repel. Holiness transforms. Satan's fall, the shadow of pride. But there's a darker thread woven through the story, a shadow behind heavenly light. Before Satan became the adversary, before he twisted truth and deceived creation, he stood close to God's throne. He was called a guardian cherub. He was beautiful, radiant, honored. But holiness was not enough for him. He wanted something else, glory for himself. Where the living creatures cry, "Holy," Satan whispered, "Me." Where the elders cast their crowns, Satan tried to keep his. Where heaven surrendered, Satan demanded. His fall was not a clash of power. God was never threatened. His fall was a clash of worship. He refused to take the posture of the creatures. He refused to surrender what he held. He refused to reflect God's glory. He wanted to steal it. And that is why the worship of heaven is so powerful, because it is the very thing Satan despises. Heaven declares what Satan denies. Heaven reflects what Satan rejected. Heaven reveals what Satan tries to hide. Every cry of holy is a victory over pride. Every crown laid down is a triumph over rebellion. Every moment of worship is a reminder that God alone is worthy. The creatures as a symbol for us. You and I are not asked to be creatures with wings and eyes. We are not asked to stand before a fiery throne or cast down golden crowns. But we are invited into their posture. They teach us to look, to see, to recognize God in every moment, to respond with worship that flows from revelation, not routine. They teach us that worship is not an event. It is a natural reaction of a heart that beholds God. They teach us that holiness is not frightening. It is healing. It is beauty. It is the invitation to be transformed. And they teach us that the closer we draw to God, the more clearly we will see Him, and the more deeply our worship will flow, drawing near to the throne. As we move deeper into this story, as we follow the creatures nearer to the throne, nearer to the sea of glass, nearer to the presence of the one who sits enthroned forever, something changes. The creatures are no longer simply characters in a heavenly scene. The elders are no longer distant figures. The throne is no longer a symbol. It becomes personal. It becomes a place you can imagine stepping into, not with fear, but with awe. And as we look at the four creatures, we begin to realize that their worship is not meant to stay in heaven. It is meant to ignite worship on earth. Worship in our homes. Worship in our quiet moments. Worship in our struggles. Worship in our victories. Because the God they adore is the same God who loves us. And as the story continues, we will see that everything, the creatures, the elders, the visions of prophets across history, all point towards something greater. A truth so powerful it can transform not just how we worship, but how we live. And that truth will ultimately lead us into the heart of the conclusion that awaits. A conclusion that brings all these visions together into one breathtaking reality. Conclusion, storytelling style. As the journey of the disciples winds toward its closing chapters, we begin to sense a shift, gentle at first, like the slow dimming of a lantern at dusk, but unmistakable nonetheless. The scenes we have walked through, moments of confusion, of revelation, of trembling hope and wavering faith, now come together like individual brushstrokes, forming a single sweeping masterpiece. And though the disciples themselves do not yet see the full image, we, standing centuries later, can trace the outline of something profoundly intentional, something that has been building since the very first step. The closer they walked with Jesus, the more they realized that his path was not simply a path of miracles and wonders. It was a path of transformation, one that reached deeply into the hidden corners of their hearts. They did not merely follow a teacher. They followed the one who could unravel their fears, challenge their assumptions, and gently rebuild them from the inside out. And this slow but steady transformation, this reshaping of ordinary fishermen, tax collectors, and wanderers into bearers of a kingdom, was the real miracle taking form. But transformation often requires a moment of breaking, a moment when the light seems to vanish, when the next steps disappear into shadow. And as we move toward the concluding arc of their story, this moment arrives not with thunder, but with a quiet heaviness settling into their steps. There were nights when they still whisper among themselves, wondering why Jesus spoke of things they struggled to grasp, of suffering, of goal where they could not follow, of a kingdom not built with earthly hands. Some of his words echoed in their minds, unsettling and yet strangely comforting. It was as if Jesus was preparing them for something beyond their imagination, something so vast and so intertwined with eternity that human language could only hint at it. And yet, even with their uncertainty, even with their questions, they kept walking, because something in his presence anchored them. Something in his voice steadied their doubts. Something in his compassion told them that whatever lay ahead, they would not face it alone. But of course, the moment came when everything would seem to fall apart. The evening shadows stretched long across Jerusalem, carrying with them a tension the disciples could not name. They gathered around the table with Jesus, unaware that this would become the meal remembered for generations, retold in countless tongues and countless places. The breaking of the bread, the cup lifted with solemn tenderness. These simple acts were filled with the weight of the world, though none of them fully understood at the time. And then came the garden, a quiet place, a familiar place, a place where the ground itself seemed to listen. Jesus prayed with a depth of anguish the disciples had never seen before. Even the silence of that night felt fragile, as the creation itself was holding its breath. The disciples, weary and overwhelmed, struggled to stay awake, caught between loyalty and exhaustion, between love and fear. And when the soldiers arrived, torches flickering like serpents of fire in the night, the disciples felt everything collapse at once. Confusion, panic, the shattering of the world they thought they knew. The teacher was taken, and with him, so it seemed, their hope. It is here, at this unsteady threshold between despair and revelation, that the final threads of their transformation are woven. Because sometimes faith is not shaped on mountaintops or in the dazzling brilliance of miracles. Sometimes faith is shaped in the silence, in the waiting, in the empty spaces where answers do not come easily. 3 days, 3 long days, but then light, a whisper of movement, a stone rolled away not by human hands. And in that moment, everything changed, not just the disciples, but for every heart that would one day hear this story and feel something awaken inside them. Their fear became courage. Their confusion became clarity. Their uncertainty became unstoppable conviction. The same fishermen who once stumbled through every question became the storytellers of a kingdom that would outlast empires. The same men who trembled in the storm stood boldly before kings. And the same hearts that once doubted now carried a message powerful enough to reshape the world. Their journey teaches us a simple but profound truth. Transformation does not happen in a moment. It happens in the walking, in the questions, in the surrender, and in the willingness to keep following, even when the path ahead disappears into mystery. And so, as this chapter of their story finds its resting place, we are left with an invitation. Quiet, gentle, but unmistakably clear. The same invitation they once received beside their boats, in their tax booths, on dusty roads under the Galilean sun. Follow me, not because the path will be easy, not because every answer will come quickly, but because the one who calls does not lead us into uncertainty. He leads us into purpose, into transformation, into life that stretches beyond the boundaries of our understanding. And as we prepare to close this journey, something tells us the story does not truly end here. In fact, it may be only beginning. The pages that follow, woven with courage, with trials, with unwavering devotion, will shape the foundation of faith passed down from generation to generation. But before we step into those pages, before we move toward the next unfolding chapter, we pause, we breathe, and we let the closing words of the story settle in our hearts, echoing across time. You are invited into the same journey. The path is open. The call remains. And the story, the great story, still continues.